What's up, my friends? I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I have noticed lately as I make these playlists, I've told you about the playlists, right? I do an annual playlist on Spotify. I used to do them on, Google Play. They keep changing the name, whatever it was. And what I do is I take all the music that I'm listening to in any given year, music that I discovered and came to appreciate in any given year. I just put it in a playlist labeled that year. And the reason that I do it is because when I was a kid, music, it's stuck in a place. It's like it all attached to my memories from my sophomore year. And it's Mr. Big, or it's Technotronic, or it's Pearl Jam. And it all just fits somewhere in my youth. But then as radio goes away and it gets replaced by streaming, we don't really have this shared story anymore, this musical soundtrack in the background of all of our brains. And so, because I like my music attached to a block of time, a window of time, and because I don't want just the first 20 years of my life to have that musical nostalgia attached to those moments of rites of passage and growth, but I want to have that for my whole life, I keep making these playlists, and that's the majority of what I listen to in any given year. As I said, label it that year, and then I can go back and revisit that whatever I want, and it's a nostalgia fest, and it's awesome. And as a side note, not that I get anything for it at all, I make a bunch of those followable on Spotify. I think it's just the 10-Minute Bible Hour. And some of you will be wildly disappointed in my musical tastes, and others of you will find it fun should you go and look it up. And if you don't want to be wildly disappointed in how dumb the music is that I like, then let's just continue to hang out here as we do and live in this blissful moment that we enjoy together. But what I'm driving at with all of this is that I've been noticing this pattern as I've been looking back over the last 10 years of playlists and working on a decade list. I have a soft spot for songs about the open road, about the highway, Springsteen-style stuff. Driving the highway, out on the roads, driving through Iowa, look at the corn. Stuff like that. It doesn't even matter what you sing about when it's a highway song. Just anything feels nostalgic, and because roads are this beautiful metaphor for growth and the trajectory of the story. And I got kids, and I'm thinking about life and age and all of that stuff. And so I become a sucker for these things. What can I say? All of that to say is that I think this is a very timeless metaphor, because stories really do work well when they follow some kind of meaning-loaded geographical trajectory. Now, we've seen that happen in the book of Matthew in the past few chapters. For the most part, the early game of Matthew is very geographically centered around the northern half of the Sea of Galilee. And that's very much a character in the story. So we have this narrative trajectory that, much like a good highway song, is attached to one chunk of land in the first third to half of the book of Matthew. And what we find is that every time Jesus ventures out beyond the narrow little boundaries of those handful of communities up north, where even there it can be difficult at times, but anytime he ventures out from there, rejection seems to be more aggressively awaiting him. It's not too tough if we just make a map of everywhere Jesus goes in the first half of the book of Matthew and put like a little green star on it everywhere something nice happens, and a mean red X everywhere something bad happens, to figure out that the closer to Capernaum he is, the higher the rate of positive incidents. The further from Capernaum, the more aggressive the rejection seems to be. And so, of course, for you and me, it takes a lot of effort to see this pattern, because we don't live there. We don't know the place. We're reading about it in books and looking at maps, and we're trying real hard. But for the original audience, this was pretty intuitive. Well, you're a Capernaum guy. Of course, if all the stuff that you're saying happened around Capernaum, you're probably going to get the best results, not flawless results, but best results there. And as you spread out, people are going to be a little more dubious, a little more suspicious of who you are and what you're up to. Well, somewhere around the end of chapter 14, the beginning of chapter 15 of Matthew, it's like we wrap up the first verse and the first chorus of this highway song, and we have a sense of what it all means. But now in the second verse, we're getting a little bit further down the road into uncharted territory, and we got the windows down, and the wind is rushing through our hair, well, maybe your hair, and we are out into new unexplored territory, and we're learning new things, and we're being stretched. In the case of the reader in Matthew, we go way outside of Jewish territory. We go way up north to Tyre and Sidon, as you and I have discussed at length in the second half of chapter 15. And while we're up there, we see new things and we learn new things. And as we continue through that second verse, which is the road trip way up north, we wind up in Gentile territory on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. And over there's a feeding of the 4,000. And we get into the second chorus of this great highway song. And it's like, whoa, the character who's singing the song, the story that we're being drawn along with, it's getting expansive here. There's more going on than just cruising Maine in the old hometown and celebrating the old small town, hometown, Midwest thing. There's something bigger occurring here. And it's interesting to see what happens when the character and the trajectory of the story goes up north and into this bigger thing. Well, as we get to the end of chapter 16, I feel like we're kind of wrapping up that second verse that's about this slightly wider world and what happens when this message goes out to a broader geography on a little bit bolder road trip. And then we wrap up chorus number 2 and we get into the bridge. And I think the bridge is what we are looking at right now in Matthew chapter 16, in what is no doubt the longest introduction before reading the text that we've ever had in the history of this podcast. And what I think we're getting right here in verse 21 is we get Peter's confession of Christ in chapter 16. Jesus says all the stuff about blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. And then he warns them not to tell anyone. And in verse 21, we get this narrative note from Matthew. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed on the third day and raised to life. Am I stretching this open highway song metaphor? Oh, yes. Yes, I am. Am I done stretching it? If you even have to ask. Apparently, we haven't been hanging out for very long. Oh, yeah, I'm going to keep stretching it. I feel like this is the bridge. And in the bridge, we're getting a hint of what the resolution is to this growth song, with geography as a metaphor for this growth. And the growth here, well, this is a minor bridge. It's a sad bridge, because Jesus intones in this brief, somber, little reflective bridge that the final verse is going to take us toward Jerusalem, which is going to be the final destination, where we'll get the final lesson, the final resolution, the final epiphany, the end of the road trip, and the conclusion of this metaphor of the growth and unfolding of this story. It's going to happen, and it's going to end in death, but also it's going to end in something that happens after death. We're going to have to unpack this whole resurrection, raised to life thing next time around, because that's the needle scratch on this otherwise neat, tidy metaphor I've stitched together. Here's the thing you need to know for today, though. John takes us back and forth to Jerusalem a whole bunch, and his gospel is more structured around 7 distinct claims of Jesus as the I am. He doesn't have the same geographical neatness and tidiness that we see in Matthew and Luke. Mark moves so quickly that the geography of it, at least to me, does not seem as structurally significant, whereas Matthew and Luke, there's this pivotal moment. Now, in Luke, it's spelled out even more directly. I don't know, maybe Matthew says something like this as well, and I just don't remember. But in Luke, there's this pivot moment, this inflection moment in the road trip song of Jesus, where it says something to the effect of, as Jesus' appointed time was getting closer, he set his face resolutely toward Jerusalem. I butchered that. It's something like that. But it really is the pivot point of the entire document, geographically, and in terms of the tension and the stakes. In Matthew, I think the structure is very clear as well. We hang out up north a whole bunch up through this moment, and immediately, after his disciples properly identify him as the Christ, we see Jesus make that flip right here in Matthew 16:21, and Jesus and the whole narrative are now pointed toward Jerusalem, which, as we'll break down tomorrow, isn't just a town that he was going to. It's a town loaded with meaning, and the fact that he's going there to die and be raised is very connected geographically to the location. So in light of all of this, I would posit the following to you, my friends. In the same way that you interpretively know exactly what to do with the language and the feel and the metaphors that are rich in a Tom Petty, Bruce Springsteen homage to the open road style song, so the original audience would have been crystal clear on what all of these geographical locations mean. and what it means that Jesus is here when this happens and here when this happens. And as they read through it and realize we're going to Jerusalem, they would have known before Jesus even finishes the whole sentence that Jerusalem does not bode well for him. This is an ominous little pivot in the metaphorical song. And because of their immersion in their own culture of the day, a bajillion things would have come to mind just at the mention of this geographical location and in the dangerous pivot that Jesus' road trip itinerary is now pointing to with Jerusalem as this final destination. And next time around, we'll dive deeper into what Jesus is actually talking about here and how this would have come off to the disciples and how Peter responds. Matt, this is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. I like you. Thanks for doing this with me. Let's do it again soon.